Welcome to Filed, a monthly conversation with those at the convergence of data privacy, data security, data regulations, records, and governance. I'm Anthony Woodward, the CEO of RecordPoint, and with me today is my co-host, Chris Brown, our Executive Vice President of Partners, Evangelism, and Solution Engineering. Continues to be a mouthful. We'll sort that out another day. But today we have a fantastic guest, which I've really been looking forward to. On the podcast, we have Alyssa Harvey Dawson, who is a board member at organizations including AppLovin and AI 2030, which I can't wait to talk more about, as well as being a former general counsel and tech exec at companies including HubSpot, Sidewalk Labs, and Netflix. Welcome to the podcast today, Alyssa.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Beautiful. And look, welcome to the podcast today, Alyssa. It's great to have you on. We're going to spend a lot of the time today talking about AI governance and especially with your experience, how boards can play a role in that. I'd love for you to just sort of give us maybe that quick tour through that resume, especially being involved with companies like Autodesk, Netflix, eBay, Sidewalk Labs, HubSpot. What stood out for you? What's been the thing that you've done in your career that you're like looking at going, this was the thing?
That's a great question. And first of all, thank you for being excited for having a conversation on AI governance. When I read what your podcast is about, you don't find a lot of people who are just like, I want to talk about AI governance, but it's so crucial these days. So I'm really happy to be here. When I think about my career, I feel like I've been fortunate to work at kind of that intersection of law, technology, and innovation. And you mentioned a bunch of the names of the companies that I've been involved with. But the through line for each of them was they were always seeking to sort of be ahead of the curve. They were innovating and creating sometimes areas, streaming technology, streaming TV, Netflix. You knew it was there, but you hadn't had the same type of impact as what they were creating. And that was what their goal was to set out and create it. Another company that you didn't mention that people probably don't know as much about was a company called Harman. I went there to head up IP because they were the first company, they were a tier 2 automotive supplier. And they worked with all of the premier automotive companies. And they were the first ones to put basically navigation, connectivity, everything that we now take for granted in cars into cars. And so I went there because they were seeing big tech come in to say, hey, we think we can own this piece. And Harman's like, hey, we already did this and we know automotive and we know how to do it better. So they were like, we've been innovating long before you guys thought this was interesting. And so don't forget us. Samsung eventually bought them because I guess they agreed. But like, again, the thing that was always there was the desire to sort of move the needle, push the needle forward beyond the cutting edge and move things. And I played my part from a legal perspective, whether that was IP governance. I eventually ended up doing data governance. Responsible AI through Sidewalk Labs was the beginning of that journey. And all of it was helping to manage risk, but really to manage it so that the innovation can keep moving forward. That was my thing. Like, how can we help the growth and direction of the company and minimize the bad stuff that can happen?
Fantastic. And what a great, we love that you're here to talk about AI governance because it's something Chris and I can probably talk about for 3 or 4 days, which we won't keep you that long, but thank you for making the time. I'd love to get some context, Anna. There's so much to unpack. When you start with a new company and you started with a few, how do you start thinking about these things with your background in legal and your background thinking about data governance and AI governance? What does that first 90 days look like and how do you start unpacking it?
You know, it really starts with understanding what the business is about, what we're building, where we're trying to go, what's the strategy, what are the business drivers. You know, I just don't think there's kind of like a world for a legal or any support team outside of the business, right? You have to be integrated in and understand and have an appreciation for where the business is trying to grow, what it's trying to do. And so for me, that was always the starting point was I'm here to understand what this business is about, and then to figure out how my function, my area, my role, if it's in the C-suite, is going to be able to advance that strategically. So you always start at the baseline of understanding the business and the industry that it's in and who it's trying to serve, the customers and the problems it's trying to solve. So that's kind of like the lens in which I went for me. And I was a journalist. I don't know if you guys were journalists, but I was a journalism major. And so one of the things that you learned in traditional journalism was, understand as much as you could about your subject matter so that you can report on it in a fair and accurate and complete way. And so I kind of like go into companies with that mindset of trying to understand as much as I can about that environment.
I think you can tell that I'm sadly just a law and technology graduate, and Chris has way more skills, I think, than me on the journalism side.
Let's just say I spent a lot more time behind a microphone, but we won't say that it's journalism, what I used to do.
Chris was a DJ.
A lot of time in very, very late nights in many, many nightclubs.
Later we can talk about, I had a friend who ran a nightclub in DC. So you might have gone to them actually, but that's
very
for
good.
So when we think about those programs, I think to boil down to today's topic on AI governance, how do you start to boil that down? And like, what are the key criteria for 2025? And let's even timestamp it October 25, because this is moving so quickly, that we should be thinking about for AI governance, and how you'd think about integrating it into that plan in a new role.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I serve on a public company board. I serve on private company boards and an advisory board. I'm a co-chair of the AI governance subcommittee of AI 2030, which is all about enabling people to develop responsible AI and put it into the mainstream such that by 2030, we're building things intentionally and responsibly, ideally avoiding some of the negative consequences. And one of the things that I realized when I started this journey was to understand, and at that time, machine learning, deep learning, that was the name that we called it, not just we, or everyone called it that. But to understand that, really you needed to understand what data and information you had or were trying to get access to, because it's the data that dictates what you're going to be able to do with that innovation. There's just it's intertwined. Understanding the data, understanding your innovation, and then ultimately, if you're in a business where you're trying to serve the needs of your stakeholders, you want to also understand how to keep the trust that you have when you are using either your own data or your customers' data or your, business partners' data. And so to me, those things are intertwined. And so it really starts with what data do I have, and how am I going to treat and use that data in a responsible and trustworthy way so that it ends up having the outcomes that we want it to have and avoid some of the negative things that could happen if I wasn't thinking about that in the right way.
You are in the right place. It doesn't get any easier or simpler than that. It all starts with the data. I think all of those compliance efforts all come back to understanding what you have, being able to know what you're then going to do with it, being able to dictate within that framework why you're doing those things. Because you might be doing things that are with sensitive data, that are with private data, but it's as long as you've got that framing. We're talking about how you do these things in terms of setting up that AI governance. And as you mentioned, you've had a bit of history as well of looking after data governance inside organizations. There is this natural blend. How do you get buy-in to take that moment to say, well, this is what we need to do before we rush ahead? Because right now, there's the MIT study that was out more recently, a very large percentage of these early adopter programs about AI failing. Probably the outcome being that most of it was we really weren't aware of what it was going to do with the data, and it didn't feel like we were quite prepared for that. How do you give that sort of that direction to a business, I think, more from that board level position that you've had the experience in?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's about a partnership, and it goes back to something I was saying earlier, which is when you come into a company or a position as a board member, you're trying to understand and work with management to understand the business drivers and what it is that the company does. If it's a technology-oriented company, what the technology differentiator is. And so I mention that because being AI ready means moving away from zero sort of have a knee-jerk reaction, like, everyone's in a frenzy. Oh, I have to have something that's AI. And you kind of forget the business fundamentals, right? You forget that what you're trying to do is come up with a thoughtful solution to a business problem that your customers have. And so to me, the thing that you do when you come into companies is you don't say to them, hey, I'm going to wave a bunch of like checklist and compliance things at you. You kind of need to bring it back to what problem are we trying to solve for the customers? Is what information, what data are we using that would help us solve that problem? And then you sort of go into okay, if that's what we're trying to do, have we thought about this outcome? Have we thought about that outcome? And you start to have that dialogue, but it's all grounded around the business solution and the problem that you're trying to solve. And I think that if you sort of do it from that vantage point, and you are talking with your partners, whether that's in product, engineering, the compliance teams, the security teams, if you're all talking about being grounded by the business solution that your AI driven solution is trying to solve, then I think you're at least talking from the same playbook and you're showing that you have an interest in furthering that innovation and doing it in a way that's smart and responsible. So I try to ground it in the business and make sure that people know we're on the same team. And it's the business team, it's the customer team, it's helping our stakeholders. And normally, most people would say, yeah, they would nod with that. They're not going to be like, oh, I don't care about helping stakeholders. People are trying to solve a problem usually. And so that kind of helps you to sort of be on the same playing field. And then you can introduce those other concepts.
Yeah, excellent. And I think you kept coming back to that customer trust, having that understanding and being a part of all of the elements of the business and bringing them back to that grounding. So I really do like that.
Yeah, I love the application of the real framework. I think that kind of leadership technique of isolating those pieces out. But I think on the ground, in reality, right, there are a number of problems that folk are trying to tackle there. So yes, grounding in the business is awesome, but we start to get into the complexity of what data, what contracts, what control, and then how do I step into that? Because there are some hard lines there, right? Employee data is tricky. Customer data is tricky. There is legislation out there with CCPA. So how do you bring that grounding of the business context, bring all of that into this conversation?
Yeah, well, I think once you're grounded in the business and you're grounded in, then that helps you to also take a step back and say, data or information do we need to use in order to solve that problem? What do we have? What might you need to bring in? And then you can get a little more granular, right? So say you're in the health space and you're coming up with a revolutionary solution or product that is going to help recommend potential therapies for people. And to do that, you think that you need access to large volumes of health data of individuals to make those predictions worthwhile and usable. So I just hit on one of the most sensitive data areas, right? Information about health and people's health and welfare, information that could impact their welfare. And so you already now know that you're dealing with some of the most sensitive of the sensitive information. And so there are obviously laws that govern, what you can do with that information and data. I'm not going to get into HIPAA and any act that comes out when it's talking about, high risk data, like you're hitting on it. But now that you've isolated, like that's the type of data and information that you have, then that should dictate some of the protections, right? The considerations, the concerns that you want to place around that data because of the category that it sits in. So I talk about framing for businesses, high, medium, and low risk data and situations. And based on where you fall, right, you're going to treat those things differently. And you're going to do it for very obvious reasons once you've isolated what you're trying to do with it. We're talking about people's, sensitive health and information and data that I'm going to want to keep that very safe and secure, probably anonymized, protected, needs to be accurate, want to be transparent. These are all like responsible AI principles, but that is a natural fallout based on the data and information that you want to use. And you're going to have partners with your product and your engineering team and wanting to do the same thing. And I certainly found that in any company that I had, like people cared about keeping that trust of the customers. And so once you sort of talk about and isolate out the data and don't sort of treat everything the same, I think you can come up with reasonable tiers of risk and make sure that your business understands how to tier those risks. You want to help them to determine what the company's risk appetite is. And then you want to see sort of thoughtful business grounded strategies to protect some of the things that are the highest risk. And then, maybe you're taking a bigger risk with some of the things that are in the low risk categories, maybe some more internal development. So that's how I think you sort of ground yourself in what to do is you really isolate what's the type of data and information, and then you come up with appropriate strategies based on where you fall. If that makes sense to y'all.
It makes perfect sense, and it makes great sense at the data level. I want to ask the more complex question in two forms though. As a board, how do I really understand the algorithmic impact assessment? Because you even have Anthropic out there today saying this is black magic and we can't even tell you how the black box computes things. And I know that's the kind of extreme example, alongside the ability to then describe that so a board can sign that risk off. Completely get at a data level, we can quantify it, we can do this in a way that I think most board members are equipped with the skills to do that. When we get to the algorithmic conversation, how does that sign off happen?
Yeah. So, board members don't have to be engineers, right? We are not making the models. I have a journalism background, right? So I surely am not going to sit in the shoes of an engineer and pretend to understand the complex calculations that are taking place. And if you are trying to do that, you're just going to knock yourself out of the water as a board member because you're never going to get there unless you happen to be that board member that has that skill set. Most don't. So what can you do? What should you be thinking about? Again, your business should be able to answer the question about what it is that they're trying to do. Not in a convoluted, engineer algorithmic way, because we're not trying to make sure that you're doing it in the right way from a computer science degree perspective. But like literally, what are we trying to do? Oh, we're trying to predict A, B, and C and X, Y, and Z. It is explainable to a board. And to do that, we're going to take this information and we're, through our black magic, we're going to use this information and it should spit out A, B, and C. I'm like, okay. So now you can process that. Like you can figure it out. So you can understand what data is being used. You can understand how the AI fits into the business model. And then that opens you up to think about the risk. So if you just told me, going back to the healthcare, I'm going to be using highly sensitive data to predict whether or not a therapy is a good avenue for someone's treatment, I don't really think I need to know exactly how that thing is doing. I can, though, ask different questions. I'm like, okay, so how are we guarding against inaccuracies, right? How are we ensuring that we're having the right level of information to be able to make that prediction? Those are the questions that you can ask around it because you can sort of see what the bad outcomes would be. And you would hope that your engineers are also asking the same questions because they too want to have something that works, right? There's no sense in doing that project if at the end of the day, your, recommendations are wrong. They're going to be recommending or telling people that therapies work or don't work, and that's inaccurate. Like your project's a failure, right? So no one's about having a failure. And so it naturally flows that you're going to do that. You can even raise bias, right? It's like, oh, how are we clear that, the test subjects, that this is going to be a good outcome for, Black or brown people who also might benefit from this gene therapy. I'm obviously making all this up, but right? But, it's going to be useful to a wider population because we want it to be sold and used by a wide population. And so it just goes back to just asking the practical questions, moving away from the black magic and just asking what the thing does and what outcomes you're trying to find. And then thinking through what are some of the outputs that could be concerning and what are the types of things that we're doing to guard against those.
I think that's a great explanation, and it helps the practitioners who would be listening to the podcast be going, you do need to just simplify these things and talk about it in a natural language way that people can understand because the board members will understand. They'll ask those critical questions about how do I protect the business? How do I ensure we're doing the right thing? As you said, how do I ensure customer trust remains through this process? In reading the article that you published in 20 Minds, it was a little bit of a link here, but the setup for we've got that AI governance and whatnot in framework. I love the fact that there's a diagram there where there is a massive overlap between AI governance and data governance. And you've touched on it a little bit here as well through the chat, but how do we, and certainly the practitioners in this world, how do we continue to beat that drum that, understanding what your data is, what are the boards really we're obviously in the data governance space, selling into very large organizations who have got lots and lots of data, but it's been a long process. I've been in this space for 20 plus years selling to these organizations, and it's always that story of, why do I need to do this? What's some advice you could give to the listener, the practitioner who's out there going, I'm a part of a large organization. We know they're looking to use AI. I think this is almost a new opportunity for data governance teams to be like, we're a big part of what needs to happen here. But what's your thoughts there, Alyssa, around how they can communicate back up to boards around why data governance is so important here?
Yeah. I mean, it really goes back to what I was saying. It's relevant because your solution that you're likely trying to get to with AI is dependent on the data and information that's going to be driving that, right? And so the two are just interwoven. I don't know, and you guys might, because I don't know of all the things that are going out there, but most of the solutions and the things that I hear about what AI can do depend on massive amounts of data. That's why people are so excited by Gen AI. Its ability to process millions upon millions of bits of information out there in relatively fast, amazingly fast speed, and to come up with solutions, outcomes. It's almost natural that you are going towards that because the success of your solution usually depends on the amount of information that you're going to be able to feed into that algorithm so that the outcome is actually going to be worthwhile. And so I think that if you just stick with what is the solution trying to do? Is it trying to help people do, whether that's customer support solution? How is it going to be helpful? Because it's helping you to process all the thousands of questions that customers have in a faster way. What is that? What are those thousands of questions? It's data, right? It's information. It's what you have come to access as part of your company. So you sort of bring it back, you tie it back to what are we trying to do? What are we trying to prove? What solution are we having? And you move it away from something that seems foreign or different, right? I think that probably we get into trouble when we treat it like it's something that's so different than other stuff that we've been before. Because then people are probably trying to figure out a different framework. I'm like, is it different because of this? It's like, no, we're going back to the same thing. When I think about board oversight, making it as part of your regular enterprise risk management solution, just like we did with cyber, it grounds it back into something that's real and tangible that people know about, as opposed to making it ephemeral. Bring it back to the basics. And I think you'll connect more with people.
Yeah, I think even in the example that you were very skillfully making up before with the health piece, is that if you go back to that low, medium, high risk, having data governance in place to know what those things are, having access to all of your data and having those things against it as well, I think it all flows down to that, what is it I'm trying to do and how am I going to do it? Here is that piece. For the listener, to the data governance practitioner out there, this is a whole new time where you are going to be a part of the solution. So
I love
get
that.
engaged.
You are part of the solution, right? You are going to help make a better product, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what the business is trying to do. They want that competitive differentiator. They want something that's going to sell. And you can be part of enabling them to do that in the best way. And so once again, that you're seen as part of the team, part of the crew that's enabling that to happen, then I think you're invited in more. If you're seen as a checklist person and in a way that's not connected, it never worked before, quite honestly, because anything that's detached from what people are trying to do to drive revenue and return on investment is going to seem like, why am I bothering? So the more you can connect what you're doing with the returns and the results that people are trying to have, the better off you're going to be at gaining traction and attention. And I've learned that the hard way. Like, you then realize, wait, how can I show that what I'm doing is actually connected to what they're trying to do? And then you see the aha, you see that, oh, yes, come in. Let me help explain to you what's happening here. And it's such a better position to be in. As a person who's figuring that out, it's such a better place to be on the inside than to be sort of like trying to peek in on the outside and figure it out.
I really appreciate you saying that. I think that is a key takeaway, even just from this podcast in general, is that you be a part of that, show them how you're adding that value. That will help to elevate into the group, and then you become part of the solution. And there's all the other elements, all the other upsides of good data governance, but this is one of those unique moments where everybody needs this. And I do appreciate that.
I'd love to drill into something you did talk about there, though, around treating for boards AI as just another component of your enterprise risk process. Do you think we need to be getting closer to what we see with the SEC cyber incident disclosure for AI? Because we don't have some of those same controls yet occurring in a way that exposes things to the public light of day. Is that a track you see us going down, or do you see a different method in that space?
Yeah, I definitely see a trend. I was just at a dinner the other day talking about AI governance with other board members of different companies. We were talking about what are the trends? What are people seeing? The Harvard Law Review on corporate governance article that was showing in 2025 that there was a growing trend towards boards adding AI governance and the risk review to either their standing committee, like sometimes you have an audit committee that's looking into this, like privacy data governance, cyber, usually with audit, or your risk committee, but, sort of adding that into the mix. And that trend was increasing by 2026, next proxy season. If you haven't incorporated this into your risk factors already, well, kind of shocking, but it's definitely going to be there. And it's also should be a standing part of your board meeting. Like people are updating their charters to be more explicit about it being a part of it. And so I do think that it falls squarely in there. It's a risk, right? You're managing a risk. It just makes sense to do that.
First time I think, Chris, ever we're starting to see that risk around data, risk around records, risk around that actually appearing on the board, which is fantastic. It's something I think we've been talking about for years. Is there a blast radius for boards to think about? What to think about, okay. And what I mean by that, is there a different framework we need to apply here in your view when we talk about AI? Because the blast radius is so much bigger and can have conceptually wider impacts, particularly, as you take yourself out a couple of years from now, and it's so intertwined in the way people work is what we're expecting. Is there a model to think about that yet in your view, or is it really just the same methods we've always used?
I don't know that the methods have to be that different. Yes, the blast radius could be very different for companies, especially if you're dealing with some of the higher risk, more sensitive areas and outcomes that could be generated from using an AI tool or model. When you're sitting back and saying, what are some of the top existential risks to the company that, as a board, you want to hear about, because we don't want to hear about all of them because companies have a lot of risk. So you're focusing on those. If your AI solution product feature falls into that, then that should be part of the discussion. Or quite honestly, it could be if you not having, an AI solution or differentiator and your competitors do, that should fall into the competitive factors or the environmental ones. And so I don't know that we have to recreate the risk framework. I think we just need to use the risk framework and see where AI fits into it or not. Because I also fundamentally believe that if you are dealing with AI in a low risk scenario, maybe for your company, it's more about your internal operations and productivity and efficiency, which is great, but it might not be as existential. I don't know that you need to bump it up into a different category just because it happens to do with AI. I think that's artificially inflating the risk. So I think we're better off trying to use the frameworks that we have, which I think are good at identifying those high, medium, and low risk and which ones to focus on as businesses, putting it in there, and then using that review to help inform how much attention should be paid by the board. I'm generally of the mindset that if we don't have to create new things for people to learn and figure out, and we can use ones that are working, why don't we? We were looking at, things like a NIST framework at other companies. And what are we talking about? Transparency, fairness, accountability. I mean, it's not that far off from what you were asking yourself. So let's not recreate the wheel unnecessarily. And when you do, you do. But let's not do it just because.
I was listening to one of your podcasts, and I'd love to know, or one of the podcasts you're on more correctly, what's your intersection between improv and AI governance? Where do you see those connecting? Because in that podcast, you talked a bunch about on the legal side, but I was keen to explore the data side.
Oh, that's so funny. I can't even remember what podcast that was where I mentioned improv.
It was on.
Oh, that was fun. That was fun. Okay. So with improv, you have to remain agile. With improv only works if the group works together. And I already talked about the importance of people being part of the solution at the end of the day. With improv, you already said agile, being part of the solution. You have to be a great listener. And so that goes back to understanding what the business is trying to do, understanding the industry and really opening your ears. There are so many great trainings from improv. And you know what? The last I'll say is with improv, you're trying to have fun, right? AI has this potential to be transformative, which improv can be as well. And to get there are going to be complex things to work through. But if we do this the right way and the responsible way and the safe way, and we have amazing things come from it, that could be a lot of fun. So let's not forget that the fun and transformative part of this new innovation is something to create as well. So those are the intersections I see.
Great answer. We should explore that one further another day.
Yes. I did not have my bingo card that we talk about improv.
That's what I do.
Alyssa, I think you mentioned a little bit, you're a part of obviously the AI 2030, where you're looking at trying to be a part of that. Where do you see this going? Let's make it 2 years into the future, because everything's moving so very quickly. I don't think we can even go 5 at this point in time. Obviously, you're discussing those things with that group. But 2 years from now, where do you see this?
If I had my way, we would have a structure where it is just commonplace for companies to embed developing AI responsibly into data design workflows. It's not a side project. It's not a team that's called compliance or legal or security. It's part of the DNA of what people are building. And it's there because people have realized that trust, accuracy, fairness, accountability are fundamental business critical principles that in whatever you do, you can't go without. And so because you care about that, you're going to care about building things the right way and the best way possible. And you don't have to sacrifice speed or innovation to incorporate that in. That's sort of my nirvana, where people are just talking about it as if it's part of the everyday, it's the mainstreams. When I think about AI governance and building frameworks for AI 2030, that's what I would like to put out there in the world so that people see it as not some complex thing that's hard to understand or figure out, but something that's an everyday and everyone's job, from the C-suite on down to incorporate.
And I would think, again, for the
AI by design, right? Privacy by design, AI by design, security by design. It's just in the DNA.
Yeah. And I think, again, for that listener, for that data governance practitioner, this is the thing to hold on to. You've got that power of helping an organization to ask those questions about the data that you've got, ensuring that we're using the right data the right way to get those outcomes should be the goal of that practitioner, to be a part of it. I think that's a great little snippet of why we should be doing this. I really appreciate that. That was great.
It's been really great having you on the podcast today, Alyssa. I did have one kind of parting question that's been gnawing at me.
This is a curveball, isn't it?
I'd love to know the last time you changed your mind on AI. Like, was there a thing you thought was a big risk, but you flipped on it 180 degrees? I always find in those learning moments when we perceive something as being it, and then we actually discover as we pull the thread, it's completely different at just those critical junctures.
During a discussion, with the stakeholders in the business, going in thinking that the thing that was being proposed to use, the AI solution, was going to cause harm, and then using some of those tools that I mentioned, listening, connecting it with the business outcome, calibrating the risk, realizing that, okay, this is less scary. So this is something that can be easily greenlit and we don't have to spend a lot of time on. And I think it's important to have those aha moments and to exhibit that you're having those aha moments so that people can know that, yes, you're able to listen, comprehend, understand, and shift gears based on the data and facts that are actually presented to you at any given time. I think that's incredibly important. It's important to get that trust from your internal stakeholders and to be then considered, part of the solution as opposed to part of the problem.
Thank you for joining us, and I really appreciate the time you spent with us today, Alyssa.
I appreciate being here. At the end of the day, I think customers and investors and employees want trust, they want transparency, they want accountability, and you can use responsible AI governance to get there. And I think that we're positioned to get there. I do feel like I hear people talking about it more at the early stages than, say, people were talking about privacy and data governance. And so to me, that's a very hopeful sign. It's appearing faster.
It's amazing what the threat of science fiction in Skynet has created. That's where people start this conversation.
It is.
Well, thanks everyone for listening as well.
We'll see you next time on Filed.